Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm Joan Freese, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives. Our guest today is Dr. Joan Freese, who is the Chair of National Security Studies at the U.S. Naval War College. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back in Central Florida.
Tell us a little bit about your work at the Naval War College, and then we can get into some of your specific areas of interest.
Okay, the Naval War College is in Newport, Rhode Island. It is part of what's known as the Professional Military Education Program, or degree granting program. About between 500 and 600 students come through every year. That includes what we call an intermediate class and a senior class. The intermediate class are officers at the mid-grade level, usually about the lieutenant commander level. The senior class are Navy captains who are tracking for admiral in many cases and going off to high command positions. The college is divided into 3 departments. Joint military operations, which is just what it sounds like. How do you move things around? Strategy and policy, which is looking at strategy through a historical perspective, and my department, national security decision making, which includes a lot of things: regional studies, leadership, strategy, force planning, how Washington works. It's a political science department plus at the institution.
So tell us about some of your particular interests. We know you're interested in space policy, and China in particular. Maybe address each of those a little bit.
I'm very fortunate because besides the teaching I do, and I happen to teach both leadership and strategy and regional studies at the Naval War College, I also teach classes up at Harvard on globalization and terrorism and space and security, which allows me to bring a lot of things together in my research fields. I do spend a lot of time looking at space security issues, and that involves everything from missile defense and the potential weaponization of space, to how the United States works or doesn't work with other countries in space, and here I guess I'm thinking in particular of China, and how the Chinese space program works. I'm one of a handful of people who tries to decipher what the Chinese are doing and why in space. Not always easy, but I think it's an important topic, and in fact, I'm going to be going to China next week to give a series of lectures on my latest 2 books on space, because they were so interested they translated the last one into Chinese.
And what are the names of the books for our audience?
My 2007 book was called Space as a Strategic Asset. That's the one the Chinese translated. Their title was Space Wars, lots more catchy. And the new book, which is coming out, is called Heavenly Ambitions, America's Quest to Dominate Space.
So that sounds very exciting and intriguing. What is your take on what we're trying to do in space and why?
Space as a strategic asset basically argued that the United States needs a comprehensive national space strategy, that we've been doing things in stovepipes. There's the military activities, and there's the civilian activities like NASA, there's the commercial, and they're all under the umbrella of very ambiguous and sometimes strict ITAR regulations for export and import. And my argument in that book was that we need to tie it all together because much of the rest of the world sees space as a tool for globalization, whereas the United States has recently seen space as a place where assets are located to act as military enhancements. So the new book picks up on that last point. What is the military doing in space? And really focuses on that, and the argument that's made is much of our efforts through the military has gone towards protecting space assets and missile defense. And I personally believe, and I should say for the audience, that these are my views and not those of the military by any means, or the Navy. I believe that's a wrong-headed approach, that technology to protect technology is an endless venture. You're never ahead, you're always playing catch up, and one that really creates more problems for the United States than it solves.
Tell us about how easily defended assets are in space. I think the popular perception is they're so far away, they're probably safe, but the reality is the opposite.
Exactly. You know, you talk about space as the high frontier. maybe Star Trek, the final frontier, but in military parlance, the high frontier. And there's this idea that if you have the high ground, if you control the high ground, you have an advantage. Well, that's certainly true if you're in the Army and you're on top of the hill behind a big rock looking down. But if you're a satellite in space, you are a bright object against a very dark sky, traveling in a very predictable orbit. And as one of my colleagues refers to it, you're a sitting duck. In fact, the technology that's being developed for missile defense is actually, according to many of the engineers I work with, better suited as the kind of weapon that could take down a satellite rather than trying to stop an incoming missile. So they are very vulnerable, very difficult to protect with technology. And when you do come up with these protections, those protections can be relatively easily thwarted.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there are certain assets in space, as you mentioned before, that no one really has any reason to attack. Tell us about those.
Yeah, I have argued that one way, and my approach is that we should take a multifaceted approach. We shouldn't necessarily not pursue technology edges to protect our technology, but that should be one approach. We should add to that codes of conduct or treaties, informal treaties, to do things like not create more debris, which is a huge problem. But one of the other arguments I make is that globalization is to our benefit. That right now there are two global utilities, the internet and GPS, the global positioning satellites, the navigation satellites, that are critical for everything from controlling civilian aircraft in the sky to facilitating ATM transfers, global economic transfers, so that an ambulance can find your house in terms of an emergency, to the Navstar system on your rental car so you don't get lost in New York City. GPS is used by everyone. Therefore, I would argue it's in no one's interest to take down one of those satellites, that they are probably the most secure satellites in orbit, not from a technical perspective, but realistically.
Mm-hmm. Hey, you were talking about missile defense. This is something that I guess in the popular consciousness has evolved now over several decades, mm-hmm. from the original SDI Star Wars concept that we had in the 1980s. Are we any closer to a system that is effective in terms of shooting down, something fired from a rogue state or from a terrorist organization or something like that? And is this still a system that is perceived as a threat by countries that are not necessarily the reasons you're erecting it?
Lots of good questions there. We used to divide our missile defense programs into two categories. Theater missile defense, to protect small areas around aircraft carriers or troop protection. And that's accepted worldwide. Even during the Cold War, the United States and the then Soviet Union had agreements to allow for theater missile defense. And there are systems that are very good at that, the Navy Aegis system among the best. There really is not a lot of controversy there. And it used to be that we put most of our efforts there, efforts as defined by budget dollars. More recently, we've put far more effort and money into the national missile defense, that's trying to stop the incoming rogue missiles or the missiles from some other country. How successful that is, how effective, and I was very grateful you used the word effective. We have an operational system. Whether or not it's an effective system is hotly debated. Most scientists who are not getting money from the program argue that it is not an effective system. Of course, if you're getting a lot of money to keep developing, you have an incentive to say, if I get enough, it'll work. Can anyone say that with enough money and enough time it can't be made to work? No. But right now, it's a very expensive system. Over the past decade, we've spent somewhere, depending on the estimate you use, between $60 and $90 billion trying to develop this technology, which still, under highly choreographed tests, is iffy at best. Is that really where we want to spend this money? What are the chances that a terrorist organization, and there is a chance, you certainly can't negate the chance, but that would be the weapon of choice for a terrorist organization. What's easier, obtaining and launching a missile that has a great big return address on it, as opposed to slipping something across the border, the suitcase bomb, something coming in on a container ship? It's a matter of probability and where you want to spend your money to try and gain as much protection as possible. The Russians have already said that they have a system that could thwart missile defense. The Chinese are known to have work done on what's called countermeasures, systems that can confuse the system. So it's a matter of where do you want to spend limited dollars, where's your greatest risk, and how do you want to spend it? Of course, the argument is if one missile with a WMD were to get through, then $90 billion, if it could be stopped, then $90 billion is absolutely worth it. It comes down to me, I would argue, and what I do argue in the book, is we ought to pay more attention to the scientists and engineers who can actually give us the best estimates for will it work.
Tell us about your work relative to China. I know that's one of your top priorities.
It is. It is. 95% or more of space technology is dual use, meaning of use to the civilian world and to the military sector. If you've got a satellite and it's taking imagery, that satellite doesn't know if that imagery is going to be used to maximize crop rotation or for weapons targeting. So when countries are spending a lot of money to build expansive space programs, as China is, it's understandably worrisome to the U.S. military as to what they intend to use that technology for. That dual-use technology issue is really exacerbated by the fact that China is still largely a very closed society. It's a stovepipe, bureaucratic society where the simplest questions can give befuddling answers. I often tell about asking an individual in China who he got his policy directives from, and this was quite a high official, and he very seriously said, "I don't know." Now, it's certainly possible he just didn't want to tell me. It's equally as plausible he didn't know, because they work in such bureaucratic stovepipes. So part of my work, being a political scientist rather than an engineer, is to try and break through their decision-making process. An early book I did was called The Chinese Space Program, The Mystery Within the Maze. And that's very much what it is. Very simple things like, give me a phone number where I can contact you. A bit of advice, if you're ever in China and you want to contact a person you're talking to, make sure and get their cell phone number. Much more likely it'll actually get answered sometime in the future than ring indefinitely. I heard an admiral who is at the Pacific Command saying he didn't know the name or phone number of his counterpart. That's a very serious situation. So part of what I do is try and break through this mystery within a maze and decipher their decision-making process, their bureaucracy, and figure out a little more about intent.
Well, I guess that's the multi-billion-dollar question. In your opinion, what are the Chinese up to, especially in space?
Well, I think they see space as part of the tool bag you need for success in a globalized world. It's all about connectivity, and they certainly appreciate that space assets are key to connectivity. The Chinese have recently become the third country in the world capable of human spaceflight. Huge achievement for them. If it were easy, other countries would have done it sooner. So we need to acknowledge that it was a big achievement. They have read, I always say, they've read the Apollo playbook. They know the many benefits you can get from a human spaceflight program. From the international prestige, the communist authoritarian government in China gets a lot of legitimacy and credibility for doing this for the people. A lot of technical jobs, a lot of interest from students in going into science and engineering programs. And I like to use a quote from a Chinese political scientist who says, "Our space program shows other countries that we can do more than make knockoff designer clothes." It shows them as a technologically advanced country and can give them an edge in international economics. So there's all that involved. There's also the spin-offs into the military sector. I'm of the belief that the benefits are more indirect than direct. When I'm capable of doing the intricate computational analysis required for human spaceflight, that also carries over into my ability to work with advanced missile technology. I think the Chinese want an expansive program that makes them a modern military. There's no doubt about that. A modern military that indicates them as a developed country, that gives them economic edge and a political prestige edge. But their program is also very prudent and incremental, top-down driven, and they are very concerned that the United States' program is seeking to drive them out. So I think there's a lot of things going on.
How does all of this play in Chinese society, where you're trying to bring as many people up from poverty or close to poverty as possible? And you can only do so many on an annual basis if you maintain the growth rate we've seen over the past couple of decades. And even in China, the people are suffering from the current recession. How do you justify spending money on space and other expensive investments when you're still struggling to bring people into the economic mainstream?
Well, John, isn't that the beauty of an authoritarian government? I'm often pointing out that human spaceflight programs are especially hard in democracies because people get to vote. People are often very supportive of space, but when you ask them to rank order it in priority for spending, it drops down considerably. In China, you don't really have that problem. When the top government officials support it, it gets funding. Now, that's not to say it isn't in competition with other things, but as long as the top leaders feel that they're getting enough benefits from it, I think they'll continue to support it. For the average Chinese person, whatever that is, and that's increasingly difficult to define since there are the rural Chinese and the urban Chinese, partially it's a jobs program. And of course, we've seen that in the United States with space as well. There are a lot of individuals who are working in technical jobs through the space program. Several years ago, I was in China, and I was at one of their launch centers, and I had an opportunity to ask one of the controllers through a translator, through an interpreter, how he liked his job. And his response was kind of interesting. He said, well, I'd like it better if I didn't have to share it with 2 other people. And clearly, there is this jobs program aspect to it. The Chinese government has been making a concerted effort to break down some of their state-owned enterprises, their mega businesses. But even that has slowed down because they always have to balance jobs with privatization. So I think the Chinese leadership is trying to move forward with this privatization and with balancing all these demands of their very large population. But it requires them to move very slowly to both maintain stability and their own political power.
I guess that was a question that kept going through my mind. How important is success in space to the long-term standing of the Communist Party? And is this something we can realistically expect to remain in place for another 20 years, 30 years, 40, 50 years? Or do you foresee eventual political change of the kind we've had in the economy over the past generation?
Well, I think change is inevitable, and I think we've seen a lot of change. I talk to people in China, and for example, they will say to me that they think American focus on human rights in China is puzzling to them sometimes, because they say human rights are better for us than they've ever been in the past. Certainly we have a long way to go, but things are getting better. The Chinese psyche, I think, is far more inclined to think change will come. If it's in 30 or 50 years, that's normal. Of course, for the United States, we tend to think in election cycles, 2, 4, 6 years at best. So I think our psyche of time expectations is very different. But I do think that we're seeing change in China, and the more globalization takes hold, the more inevitable it will be that, that the society will begin opening.
What are some of the things that you think could happen early in terms of more political openings?
Well, for example, I think the Chinese, with the internet, they have spent the past 10 years trying to continually plug the dike with how do we keep information out of China. And I think while they are still fighting that, the Chinese people themselves are finding more and more ways to constantly overcome the regulations. Mm-hmm. I think with that kind of change, and China is the second largest trading partner with the United States, the largest holder of our T-bills. Globalization has brought countries together in ways that we all are being forced to work together. And that means accommodation in lots of different areas. I ask my students at the War College, what's in the national interest of the United States? A China that's prosperous and growing, or a China that's imploding? And I think the answer to that is pretty obvious. So it's in our best interest for China to be healthy and changing, even if perhaps it's slower than we might want. And it's in China's interest to not antagonize and be overly petulant in their dealings with other countries. And I need to qualify that and say China is still, they're like a young teenager in international relations. Sometimes they have these knee-jerk reactions and do really dumb, irresponsible things, which are going to take some time to change. Mm-hmm. When they brought down one of their own satellites in 2007 and created a huge debris mess in space, their reaction was that of a petulant teenager who got caught doing something they shouldn't have. And I think we need to work with the Chinese in many ways to become more responsible members of the international community.
Mm-hmm. But as relates to changing the political system, I gather your sense is they're not going to make that kind of mistake. They saw what happened in the former Soviet Union. The experiments with, quote, democratic practices at the village level have been relatively limited. One of our advisors here, Ann Thurston, does a lot of work on village elections, and it's always a question as to what does this mean. Some of them are really democratic along the lines of what we experience in this country, and some are not. Yeah. And so it's a mixed bag. But since that's not an official unit of government, in a way it counts, but in a way it doesn't count. So exactly. do we move up from there? Is there the prospect of that?
I think a lot of the language that I see more and more focuses, rather than focus on democratization, focuses on good governance and all the things that go with good governance, building a politically responsible society, beginning to have inroads in terms of free press. The Chinese are still trying to get their central taxation system down. So in some instances, the central government really has very little control over some of the rural regions, and they're very concerned about that. So I think if we were to focus first, or encourage the Chinese to focus there, on these good governance practices and help them in any way we can, that would lead to the kind of democratization that we would certainly want, though again it's going to be a long-term process.
So you're heading out to China shortly. Mm-hmm. What do you hope to accomplish in addition to talking about your new book?
I like to do a couple things when I'm in China. I like to ask them questions. At questions like, well, where do you see your space program going? And it's interesting the variety of answers that I will get, although I must say I was just in Washington and I got the same variety of answers from different branches of our own government in terms of where our space program's going. But I like to hit home on certain points about what I consider prerequisites for cooperation in space. We used to talk about China needs to be more transparent in its intent. China really needs to be more transparent. I was at a meeting about a year ago where the Chinese delegation finally said, and this was quite unusual. Could you not use the word transparency? Transparency, when you translate it into Mandarin, has a connotation related to espionage. Could you maybe say clarity of intent? Well, okay, maybe that's legitimate or maybe it's not. But if those are the kind of simple things that we can do, I will go over and argue for more clarity of intent. I will go over and stress that we need to have more of these contacts. We need China to understand the very dangerous debris problem they created with their 2007 ASAT test, and not to do any more of those kind of tests. That's an area that I think is really ripe for cooperation, debris in space, and I think the Chinese, that'd be something that we could work on with them early. So those are the kind of messages that I try and deliver. The other thing that very often happens is I will talk about space, and then I'll stop for questions. The first question I get will be someone wanting me to explain how the American government works. Well, as you and your listeners know, that's hard for us to understand sometimes. But I often end up giving a lecture on Congress. So those are the kind of things that I will be discussing when I'm there.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you for the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.